There's a word or a phrase that's very common these days, which irritates me every time I hear it, even though it has something what I think is quite important to say. And against it is another phrase which is very common in business, which kind of says what a lot of leading edge thinkers in the field are trying to say. And I think there's something wrong and right with both of them. The two phrases are baby steps, irritates me, and stretch goals, something that is kind of trendy within particularly popular business thinking these days. And the problem with stretch goals versus baby steps is that they form two ends of a spectrum that both have something useful to say, but both of them have flaws and problems in relation to this tension between mastery and misery. So baby steps tends to be associated with take small, not very ambitious steps towards a long-term goal, whereas stretch goals or stretch targets tends to suggest that by setting our targets very, very high, beyond a little bit beyond our comfortable capacity, we can actually make ourselves more successful by tapping into our sense of challenge, which I've talked about in previous videos. Now, I'll come back to those two issues a little bit again. But in this series of mini lectures, I've been talking a lot about the trouble with managers doing what we think managers should do, which is showing leadership and exerting control over the organization. And I'll also talk about the trouble with a very different end of the management puzzle, this issue of Taylorism. Taylorism, to remind you if you haven't heard of the term, is related to a very early business theorist from the United States who actually revolutionized the way we did things, made things within companies and factories all around the world by breaking things down into very small measurable components, going back to our SMART goals from the previous lecture, and making sure that people were properly rewarded for very specific small tasks which they could easily do. So it created the foundation of mass production, which led to, for example, cheap Model T Fords pumping off the Ford Detroit manufacturing lines and made everything from iPhones to toys very, very cheap these days. The trouble with Taylorism is that it does what control does, which is disempower the individual who's being controlled or who's being measured. But the good thing about Taylorism is that it is a very good example of how baby steps do work for humans, because it asks you to do only a very small element of what people formerly did do. So complex tasks were broken down into, which most of us were beyond our ability to do, were broken down into tasks that were very easy for us to not just do, but master, become extremely good at. And this is something that I do talk to students about, is that by setting yourself achievable small goals and then thoroughly mastering them in a manner that almost suggests mass production, you can then step up to the next goal, because anxiety in relation to performance is one of the things that does hold a lot of us back. It holds me back in relation to certain elements of my career, and I wouldn't mind betting it holds you back as well. So this is an issue of actually taking control of your own anxiety. When you take control of the tasks that you set yourself, you can master it and become better at it. Now, I'm not trying to create here a kind of motivational video. I will keep on topic and look at the issues in relation to goal setting and how it works. The trouble with humans, we're complicated. I'll just bring up these three theories that I'll just briefly talk about. Equity theory. The trouble is that when we set goals, we compare ourselves with other people, and we have this unerring habit of comparing ourselves with people who are not like ourselves. They are maybe more successful or more intelligent or better looking than ourselves. And we end up coming regularly, not surprisingly, short, because we're continually setting ourselves these stretch targets or stretch goals. And that ends up, as I've sort of said, disempowering and disheartening us. Expectancy theory is another interesting theory from this perspective. Expectancy theory asks us do I know what I need to do? And will doing what I'm currently doing lead to a good performance, a good outcome? And then finally, as a third stage, which I haven't mentioned there, is the outcome going to be valuable to me? Is it going to be rewarded in a way that is salient or relevant to myself? And finally, the issue, particularly for managers, is this issue of expectancy in general. As a psychologist, I am struck by the number of times expectations about behaviour, expectations about outcome, which form the very body of expectancy theory as it's taught within a workplace setting. That expectancy comes up again and again as almost as powerful as reality itself in determining reality. What we expect will happen more often than not does happen. So this is where having low expectations about yourself can lead to low outcomes or low outputs. So having those stretch goals as opposed to taking those baby steps can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Pygmalion Golem and Hawthorne effects tend to be particularly relevant for managers. But imagine how powerful you as a self-manager are in relation to yourself. So let's take the Pygmalion effect. If you tell managers, if you're delivered by an outside consultant, the news on paper, for example, saying, such and such and such and such an employee are actually secretly extremely able. You may not have noticed it, but they've got, particular abilities which we think will lead to very high performance within this particular organization. Then lo and behold, simply being delivered that information will change the way, even if you do not communicate that directly to those two employees, that will still lead to an significant increase in performance and even long-term performance of those employees. In other words, your expectations about your employees will lead them to fulfill those expectations. You somehow magically and non-verbally signal to your employees something to do with your expectations about them. So you as an employer do need to have high expectations of your employees, or at least positive expectations. There's the theory 1, theory 2 type of thinking comes in here. If you've read that in your textbook, you'll recognize what I'm thinking about. But certainly having positive thoughts about your employees will, the evidence is very strong on this, lead to positive outcomes. The issue is, how does this work in relation to our own individual self-management as opposed to other management? And I do believe, but evidence is not as strong on this, is that you need to be very careful about the tension between these two levels of expecting too much from yourself and expecting too little. Because, as I said before, human beings are delicate creatures. We all are delicate, anxious, worried creatures, because we have the ability to look ahead and look back and look around in terms of equity theory, for example. And this causes us to be a bubbling brew of anxieties and worries. And managing those is often one of the best ways to improve your own performance and treat yourself as a project that can be improved. Looking at organizational structure, it's important to remember that individuals have strengths as well as weaknesses, and that you need to, in the way you set up the structure of an organization, not just exert a one style fits all, one flavor, single size fits all type of approach. Span of control is an interesting one. I'll just touch on that briefly. You probably have heard of this, is where a single manager, the span of control relates to how much power a single manager has and how many people are directly reporting to that manager. A very large number of people reporting to a single manager means a wide span of control, and a narrow span of control is the opposite. the issue of departmentalisation, which I have talked about, where people are slotted into small silos or departments within an organisation, and the issue of centralised power, which relates, of course, to span of control. I'm just throwing some of these terms at you just to remind you of them and ask you to reflect on how these types of forms of control can fail to take into account the individual strength of your individual employees. As a manager, one of the moments for me, one of the aha moments for me, came when I realised that when I was recruiting, when I was sitting as a boss, talking to candidates coming to me for job interviews, when I realised that each one of them was unique and that by giving them a wage, I had the capacity to employ the whole of them, not just employ their hands and their eyes, but to employ their heart, their soul, their enthusiasm, their energy, their experience, their background, their uniqueness. And when I started to realize that, I took a very different approach to recruiting and started to look for diversity, look for spark, looking for individual elements related to attitude, and look how I could foster that individuality to fit within my control, to fit within my departments and my central structures of the organisation. So the structure still exists, but you need to have the flexibility to recognise the uniqueness of the individual. But that was a very powerful moment for me to realise that as a manager, you were employing whole human beings